we're going to continue with our exploration of the cerebrum of the human brain, and we're going to go a little bit further. So far we've talked about the first two lobes, which are the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. And those two lobes really have a lot of jobs. They kind of are all over the place. But the two main jobs of those two lobes, for the frontal lobe, we have this association area, which is going to deal with the thought, thinking, right? So that's going to be our conscious thought. So we're going to talk a little bit about consciousness in here. And that is really, a lot of that has to do with your frontal lobe. But we also have this motor cortex, and that's the part of your brain which controls your voluntary movement. So this area here is going to really be connected to your spinal cord, which is then going to connect to your skeletal muscles. And then in our parietal lobe, we have our somatosensory cortex, which is going to be the information coming up from the body through our ascending tracts. They're going to cross over at the medulla, and then you're going to have the right side of your brain interpreting the left side of your body, and vice versa. And then finally, the parietal lobe has a lot going on in terms of its association area. It's related to things like memory, but one of the main things that we know the parietal lobe is really responsible for is language, and understanding language, knowing the correct words and the syntax of words, semantics, things like that. Really important part of human function is our ability to have language, and we'll talk more about that as we go through. Okay, we're going to go into the next set of lobes today, and then we'll finish up talking about something called the basal ganglia. All right, so the next lobe that we're going to talk about is the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe sits all the way in the back of your brain. So if you're looking at the brain model, which I have over here, your occipital lobe really is going to be back here. It's the most posterior portion of the brain. And that has one job. That is going to be interpreting visual information. So that's weird, right? Our eyes are at the front of our head. So our eyes would sit right here. So if this is the skull here, brain here, your eye would be sitting right here. And it sends information through optic nerves to the back of your brain. And they actually cross over. It's called the optic chiasma. And that is because those are actually going to form an X shape. So your right eye crosses over and gets interpreted to the left part of your brain. And your left eye gets interpreted by the right part of your brain. And that is called the occipital lobe. And again, that is for interpreting visual information and creating an image. So occipital really has that one job. The second lobe that we're going to talk about today is the temporal lobe. And that is going to be right here on the sides of your skull. So essentially, your temporal lobe is going to be this portion of your brain right here. And that is responsible for auditory information. So that's hearing. But it does a little more than that. So the temporal lobe actually has a lot to do with memory. And there's a lot going on, but we're going to focus on auditory memories and auditory processing. So hearing information and processing it. And there's actually a special area in the temporal lobe that I'm going to talk about. It's called Wernicke's area, and it's right here. So if you remember back to the frontal lobe, I mentioned Broca's area. And Broca's area is specific to the muscles of language. So when I say the words that are coming out of my mouth right now, I'm able to say them because my mouth and tongue are moving in different ways to create these sounds, which make words. They vibrate the air in a certain way, and then when your ears pick them up, you can make sense out of those words. So Broca's area is going to be how to actually physically make those words. Wernicke's area, on the other hand, that is determining what those words mean. So Wernicke's area is responsible for giving analysis of spoken language. So it ties into what I mentioned about the parietal lobe as well. So again, like I said, one of the best ways to see how something works is to look at it when something goes wrong. And Wernicke's aphasia is a type of condition that occurs, again, with stroke patients often. If the blood flow gets cut off to that part of the brain, and that part of the brain stops being able to function correctly, you get something called Wernicke's aphasia. And in that situation, you're able to speak, so it's not like Broca's aphasia. In Broca's aphasia, you know what you want to say, you just can't make the words come out of your mouth. In Wernicke's aphasia, on the other hand, you can speak, you can talk, hey, hi, my name is this, I'm blah, 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 right? You're talking, but the words make no sense. So you think you're saying one word, but the word that comes out of your mouth is different. It's not that actual word. So that is Wernicke's area. It's important for analyzing actual language and what the words are and the appropriate word coming out at the appropriate time. So that's how you can tell when someone's having a stroke sometimes. They just start to say nonsense. And the reason why they're saying nonsense is because that part of their brain is being interrupted and the words are not matching up with their meaning. And then finally, the fifth lobe, which is going to be deep in the sulcus right here, really, is called the insula. And the insula, there's not a lot to say about it at this point because they're still trying to figure it out. But what we do know about the insula is it's related to emotions. So the insula, it kind of taking information from all the other lobes and processing it, and it's connected to your emotional state. So again, not a lot of information about it at this point, at least not at the level that I teach. So we're going to keep moving through and get a little farther into the brain. So we talked about the cerebrum, and the cerebrum is that cortex, that gray matter on the outside of the brain, the stuff that makes us human. It separates us from other animals. The rest of the brain from this point down is going to be very similar in other animals and other organisms. So the basal ganglia is the next portion of the brain that we're going to be talking about. And what the basal ganglia is, it's also called the basal nuclei. It's a network of gray matter that's found deep within the cerebrum, the cerebral hemispheres. So it's going to be deep in the brain in this area here, and it's going to be, basically, it's a relay station. So it's taking information from the cortex and sending it down to the spinal cord. So think of the basal ganglia as the editor of information going out to the spinal cord and out to the body. And the main thing that we know of is it produces a lot of dopamine in this area. And dopamine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. And what it does is it helps control movement. So what's a great example of basal ganglia gone wrong? Well, Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease is a condition where people lack motor skills. They start to shake. They have these tremors that exist. And what's happening there is essentially the brain is sending too much motor information out to the body. And normally the basal ganglia would be the thing that edits that and allows you to just control your movement. Remember, in order for a muscle to contract, it needs to hit threshold. And in order for it to hit threshold, it needs to have a certain amount of stimulation. So what this does is it limits that and it allows us to control our movement better. Nice fluid movement. So when things are going wrong, that's going to be the basal ganglia that's having the problem. So if you look here, you can see, so this would be the motor cortex here. So it would send information through pathways, and the neurons would pass through this basal ganglia, and the basal ganglia will be able to edit that information as it goes down to the spinal cord and then out to the muscles. And that's just a way to be able to control your movement in a better way. Okay, let's keep finishing up here with our last bit of information. Okay, we're going to finish up here. We talked about the basal ganglia. Essentially, it regulates motor activity. And now we're going to finish up with the last bit that I want to focus on, which is the diencephalon. And we're going to spend more than one lecture on this because the diencephalon actually has a lot going on. The diencephalon is in the same area as the basal ganglia. They actually take up the same real estate. But let's go through it real quick. The diencephalon is made up of more than two areas, but we're going to focus on two areas first. And the first one is called the thalamus. And the thalamus is a really important part of our sensory information. So the thalamus sits right here in the center of the brain. So you can see it's like right there, that little tiny blue circle is where the thalamus exists. And what it does is as sensory information comes into the brain from your senses, think of the thalamus as the switchboard operator. It sends the information to the right part of the brain to get interpreted. So if you've ever seen those old-timey shows where they call up the operator and they say, I need you to connect me to this person, and then the operator's got a switchboard and they plug it into a different place, and that way you can get connected to the person you want to get to. That's essentially what's going on here. Sensory information comes up the spinal cord from the body. It comes in from the ears through the temporal lobe. It comes in through the eyes. It comes in through the nose. So we have all this information coming in, and it gets channeled through the thalamus to go to the part of the brain where it needs to get interpreted. So think of the thalamus as being the switchboard operator of the brain. And as you can imagine, if things go wrong with your thalamus, information is not going to get interpreted correctly. So the thalamus is extremely important for having the brain function, operate the way it's supposed to. So that way the part of your brain that's supposed to be interpreting the information is. If it's not working correctly, you're going to have information not get to where it needs to go. So thalamus, extremely important part of our sensory information coming into the brain and getting interpreted by the cerebral cortex. So think of it as the opposite of the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is basically editing information as it leaves your brain and goes out to your body. The thalamus is doing the same thing, but it's taking information coming from your body and from the environment and sending it to the correct place in the cerebrum to get interpreted. And we're going to finish up with our last bit of information today, and that's going to be our hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus sits just below the thalamus. Hypo means less, so the hypothalamus is below the thalamus. And that's the only connection it has with the thalamus, actually. They have nothing to do with each other in terms of their function. They're just named based on their location. And what the hypothalamus does is that's like the control center of your body. That is what controls homeostasis. So as blood passes through your hypothalamus, it's keeping track of things like blood sugar. It's keeping track of things like blood pressure, temperature of your blood. So this is what triggers your body to react. So if your blood temperature goes too low, your hypothalamus is going to kick your muscles into shivering, right? If your blood sugar goes too low, it's going to make you hungry. That feeling of hunger that you get when your stomach growls, that's because of your hypothalamus. It also controls things like sleeping and waking up, and growth. So that's what controls your pituitary gland to release growth hormone. So all these things are controlled by your hypothalamus. It's called the master gland, essentially. That's where the pituitary gland is, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, which sits just to the hypothalamus, just inferior to it. So your pituitary gland's here and your hypothalamus is here. But what you need to know about the hypothalamus is it controls all of your homeostatic mechanisms. So anything to do with the levels of your body, your heart rate, your blood pressure, that's all being controlled by your hypothalamus. And that's why when people have tumors on their hypothalamus, it can affect their weight, or it can affect, their body temperature. They might feel hot all the time. And that's because the hypothalamus is not functioning correctly. I think that's enough for today. Thank you very much.